Today's story is one you won't forget, a gripping courtroom showdown that flips the script on everything you thought you knew about politics, power, and the law. At the center of it all, Karoline Leavitt, a 27-year-old White House press secretary, who walked into court mocked and underestimated and walked out with the nation on her side. Get ready for shocking twists, legal brilliance, and a battle that proves age means nothing when you're armed with the truth. The rising Miami sun cast long shadows across the steps of the gleaming federal courthouse, where a swarm of media had already staked out every corner. Reporters adjusted their microphones, photographers shouted over one another for position, and protesters on both sides of the political aisle chanted slogans that echoed through the marble atrium. Above the chaos, banners fluttered. "No one's above the law" on one side and "Stand with Karoline" on the other. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb and the crowd surged forward. Out stepped Karoline Leavitt, 27 years old, the youngest White House press secretary in American history. Her navy blazer was crisp, her blonde hair pulled into a low twist, and in her arms was a leather brief brimming with legal documents. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. Her eyes, cool and focused, scanned the courtroom's steps like a soldier walking into enemy territory. The chants rose louder, but Karoline didn't flinch. This wasn't her first battle, but it might be her most public. Inside, security ushered her through checkpoints while cameras flashed from every angle. Alan Rourke, her quiet defense attorney and a former Navy JAG officer, waited at the entrance of courtroom 4C with a simple nod. "You ready?" he asked. Karoline gave a slight smirk. "Always." As she entered the courtroom, every seat was filled. Rows of reporters, law students, federal employees, and political activists craned their necks for a better look. On one side of the gallery, a group of Gen Z supporters live-streamed on TikTok, whispering her name like it was already part of history. On the other, skeptics in tailored suits murmured with smug anticipation, expecting a swift takedown. At the judge's bench sat Raul Mendez, stern, graying, and infamous for his disdain for political theatrics. He shuffled papers as Karoline took her seat at the defense table. Across the aisle, prosecutor Laura Vincenti adjusted her sharp gray blazer and flashed a confident smile. The courtroom fell into a hushed tension, like the moment before a lightning strike. Karoline folded her hands, rested them on the table, and stared straight ahead. She wasn't just defending herself today. She was defending the administration, her generation, and the right to speak in a system written before her voice was ever allowed. The trial of the decade had begun. Judge Raul Mendez leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, adjusting his glasses with the same casual disdain he reserved for late motions and cable news segments. His reputation preceded him, a constitutional purist with little patience for what he once referred to as #justice and viral courtroom theater. As he flipped through the morning docket, he glanced over his glasses at Karoline Leavitt and gave a dry, knowing smile. "Well," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm, "looks like we've traded the law books for trending tags today." Chuckles rippled through the gallery. Laura Vincenti, the lead prosecutor, rose confidently from her seat, smirking. "Your Honor," she said smoothly, "this isn't about hashtags. It's about accountability. Ms. Leavitt used her official position at the White House podium to declare that, and I quote, Canada is on its knees before Trump's tax policy." Gasps and murmurs stirred the courtroom. Mendez raised an eyebrow. "Colorful," he muttered. Vincent continued, her voice growing sharper. "That wasn't commentary, that was political theater disguised as a press briefing. It violates the Hatch Act, a federal law that prohibits executive branch employees from engaging in political activity while on duty." She held up a highlighted copy of the statute, dramatically placing it on the podium. "Ms. Leavitt crossed a line, and this court must decide whether she used her power to promote an administration rather than inform the public." Karoline sat still, hands folded, expression unreadable. Mendez turned toward her, his tone hardening. "Ms. Leavitt, I do hope you understand the seriousness of these proceedings. This isn't a press conference. You can't spin your way out of a federal courtroom." The gallery laughed. Cameras clicked. The moment felt like a trap, but Karoline didn't react. No eye roll, no rebuttal. She simply stared ahead, letting the silence speak. The judge blinked, perhaps expecting defiance or fear, but got neither. Lara Vincenti seized the pause. Her silence isn't restraint, Your Honor. It's a calculated delay. She's stalling because she knows what she said was indefensible. She gestured toward the jury. We're not here to debate words, we're here to judge actions. And hers were political, reckless, and deliberate. Mendez glanced once more at Karoline. Well, he asked, do you have anything to say, Ms. Leavitt? Or are we to presume you're waiting for your next retweet to make a move? The gallery erupted in laughter again, reporters scribbling furiously, but Karoline remained composed, her lips pressing into a neutral line, as if memorizing every insult for later dissection. She wasn't being outwitted, she was observing, waiting, and in doing so she began to shift the balance of the room. The performance had started, and she hadn't spoken a single word. Lara Vincenti rose from her seat like a conductor stepping before an orchestra, her confidence sharp as her tailored gray blazer. She paced slowly before the jury box, each step deliberate, each glance calculated. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, voice steady and rich with conviction, we're not here to debate politics. We're here because one woman chose to weaponize her position to advance an agenda and violated the law in the process. She gestured broadly to the courtroom, holding up a large, printed quote. Canada is on its knees before Trump's tax policy. Murmurs swelled. Reporters clicked their pens. Vincenti turned back to the jury, letting the silence stretch before driving the point home. That wasn't a private opinion. That was an official statement, spoken from the White House podium, broadcast live to millions, and designed not to inform, but to intimidate. She walked over to the evidence cart, lifting a thick binder labeled Hatch Act violations, press briefings, flipping it open with flair. This wasn't a one-time slip, this is a pattern of political messaging disguised as public service. From her statements about the Hamas negotiations to her commentary on Pentagon reforms, Ms. Leavitt has blurred the line between communication and campaigning. She turned toward Judge Mendez, handing a highlighted page. Exhibit A, Your Honor. Page 14 of the Hatch Act clearly outlines that no executive branch employee shall use their position to influence foreign or domestic politics for partisan purposes. The judge glanced at the document, nodding slightly. Then Vincent paused, almost theatrically, and yet, just when you think the line couldn't be crossed further, she snapped her fingers toward an aide who rolled out a monitor. We have this. With a click, the screen played a short clip from a February 15th press briefing. Karoline's voice came through the speakers. Canada is on its knees, and frankly, they deserve it for standing against America. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. One of the jurors shifted uncomfortably. The press gallery exploded in motion, cameras firing, pens flying. Vincent let the moment sink in. This wasn't just political. This was diplomatic sabotage. A statement like that could jeopardize foreign relations, and she said it as the face of the U.S. government. Vincenti stepped back toward the jury, her tone hardening. We cannot allow public servants, especially ones with global microphones, to bend truth into campaign slogans. The Hatch Act was written to stop this exact abuse, and yes, while the technology has changed, the principle hasn't. Public trust cannot be leveraged for political gain. She turned toward Karoline, who remained calm, unreadable. The defendant wants you to believe this is about censorship or outdated laws, but it's not. It's about responsibility, and today we ask you to hold her accountable. She returned to her seat, smoothing her blazer with quiet satisfaction, her message echoing in the stunned silence that followed. The judge looked to Karoline, eyebrow raised. Miss Leavitt, he said, that was quite the case laid against you. But she said nothing. Her eyes remained on the jury, not as a plea, not in fear, but with the sharp calculation of someone who knew the difference between sound and substance. And the prosecution had just delivered its opening blow. But the room was about to learn that silence can be a prelude to strategy, and not surrender. As the echoes of the prosecution's dramatic presentation faded, all eyes shifted to Karoline Leavitt. The jury turned, anticipating a fiery rebuttal or at least a crack in her composure. Judge Mendez leaned forward slightly, tapping his pen against the bench, visibly impatient. Reporters poised their pens, ready to transcribe her first words. But Karoline didn't move. She didn't shift in her seat. Her fingers remained lightly clasped on the table, her posture unshaken, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Prosecutor Laura Vincenti folded her arms, smirking as if victory was already secured. "Nothing to say, Miss Leavitt?" she called out, her voice tinged with mockery. "No spin today?" The judge chuckled under his breath, adding, "This isn't TikTok. No time for retweet strategy." Laughter bubbled up from the gallery, and even a few jurors cracked small, uncertain smiles. But Karoline remained still. The courtroom couldn't tell if she was frozen or fearless, and that made them nervous. What they didn't realize was that Karoline's silence wasn't weakness, it was precision. In that moment, she was taking inventory of every accusation, every misquote, every legal thread being dangled in front of her. Her stillness wasn't passive, it was tactical. She knew the room expected her to panic, to ramble in defense, to lean into the chaos. But she also knew that if she waited just a bit longer, if she let them believe she was cornered, the blowback from her response would land twice as hard. Alan Rourke, seated beside her, didn't speak either. He knew better. They had prepared for this. They knew Laura Vincenti would come out swinging with drama, and they knew the gallery would eat it up. Until the facts started cutting back. The seconds ticked by. Jurors began exchanging glances, some skeptical, some intrigued. Reporters hesitated, unsure whether to label her silence as arrogance or strategy. A few younger attendees, students from Miami Tech sitting in the back row, leaned forward with interest rather than judgment. For the first time since the trial began, the air in the courtroom began to shift. Not because Karoline spoke, but because she didn't. The laughter faded, the smirks softened, doubt crept in, and just like that, Karoline Leavitt, without saying a single word, had made them listen. The silence broke, not with a shout, but with the sound of papers rustling. Karoline Leavitt, still seated, calmly lifted a manila folder from her briefcase, laid it flat on the table, and opened it with the unbothered grace of someone thumbing through brunch menus. Not legal warfare. She glanced toward the judge, then toward the jury, and finally at Laura Vincent, her expression unchanged. And then, with a voice smooth as marble but laced with a Gen Z edge, she spoke. "Your Honor," she began, her tone measured, "I'd like to thank the prosecution for their performance. They nailed the drama. Honestly, I almost clapped." A few chuckles, nervous and scattered, floated from the gallery. Judge Mendez narrowed his eyes but didn't interrupt. Karoline continued, standing now, slowly smoothing the hem of her navy blazer as she rose. "Unfortunately," she added, "they picked the wrong opponent, and the wrong script." She stepped forward, holding a marked-up copy of the Hatch Act. "Let's start with the law," she said. "The prosecution claims I violated the Hatch Act by making a politically charged statement during a press briefing. What they failed to mention, or maybe deliberately avoided, is that the Hatch Act was written in 1939. You know what didn't exist in 1939? TikTok, X, the digital press room, the 24/7 news cycle, and certainly not a world where every press secretary is expected to communicate policy through platforms invented 70 years later." She held up another document, highlighted and tabbed. Section 5.2 of the Hatch Act says violations must be directly tied to electioneering. My statement was made in February 2025. President Trump wasn't campaigning. There wasn't even an election year. So, what exactly are we prosecuting? My tone. The gallery began to stir. Reporters froze mid-note. Judge Mendez leaned forward, his pen no longer tapping. Karoline paced slowly now, gaining rhythm. "They say I politicized policy. No, I described it. They say I misled the public. No, I spoke bluntly, which, as far as I know, isn't a crime." She flipped to another document and held it toward the jury. Jenkins v. State Department, 2018. The case where an official was accused of violating the Hatch Act over a tweet. You know what the court ruled? If the law hasn't been updated to cover social media, You can't prosecute based on assumptions. You need new legislation. Guess what Congress hasn't passed? Anything that updates the Hatch Act for modern communication. Now the murmurs turned into something more serious, momentum. Karoline didn't flinch. She locked eyes with Lara Vincent. You're trying to hold me to a law that doesn't even recognize the world I work in. That's like enforcing traffic laws on someone flying a drone. Laughter broke from the corner where Trump supporters had gathered. Even some members of the jury cracked smiles. And let's not ignore the timing of this case, she added. You bring in a last-minute audio clip that was conveniently missing from the original evidence packet. Why? Because after I dismantled your argument, you needed a new one. She paused. This isn't justice. This is a PR stunt disguised as prosecution. Judge Mendez cleared his throat, raising a hand. Ms. Leavitt, this court is not a press room. Karoline nodded. Respectfully, Your Honor, that's exactly my point. The Hatch Act governs press room behavior as if it's still 1940. And if the law's outdated, then its enforcement isn't justice, it's entrapment. She placed her stack of documents firmly on the table. I don't disrespect the law. I'm asking you to look at the law and see it for what it is, out of sync with the world it's supposed to regulate. She turned to the jury once more, her tone slowing, deepening. I've been called arrogant, reckless, even dangerous. But I'm not afraid of judgment. I'm afraid of silence, of letting broken systems stay broken because we're too scared to challenge them. Today, they're not just trying to punish me for my words, they're trying to make sure no one like me ever speaks them again. She paused. But here I am. The courtroom had flipped, no longer amused, no longer dismissive. Reporters stared wide-eyed, jurors leaned forward, and Judge Mendez, for the first time, looked like a man who'd just been handed a question he wasn't prepared to answer. The moment Karoline returned to her seat, the courtroom didn't exhale, it braced for the blowback. Prosecutor Lara Vincent shot up from her chair, her confident facade now showing visible cracks. Her voice rose a half octave as she addressed the jury. Don't be fooled by theatrics, she snapped, pointing at Karoline. This is deflection, pure and simple. She's twisting the law to dodge accountability. She snatched the Hatch Act binder from her desk and flipped it open with force. Yes, it was written in 1939, but the intent of the law hasn't changed. Stop executive branch officials from using their positions to influence politics. Whether that's with a radio broadcast or a tweet, doesn't matter. She jabbed her finger at the air, her tone sharpening. Miss Leavitt didn't just inform the public, she glorified her boss's policies while mocking our allies. That's propaganda, not public service. But Karoline didn't flinch. She stood again, her voice calm and clear. Intent matters, but so does language, and the law's language is specific. It says electoral influence, not policy enthusiasm. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, the statement I made wasn't tied to any campaign event. It wasn't in the context of an election. It was in response to a press question about tariff negotiations. That's foreign policy, not political speech. Vincenti scoffed. So now mocking Canada is part of foreign policy? She retorted, sarcasm dripping. Karoline's gaze sharpened. It's called commentary on geopolitical leverage, she replied. And last I checked, sarcasm wasn't a felony. The judge raised a hand, his tone tighter now. Enough, but the tension only thickened. Jurors looked back and forth between the two women like spectators at a championship tennis match. The gallery was still, reporters' fingers hovering over keyboards, unsure whose side momentum now favored. Lara Vincenti tried once more to redirect. She's trying to make this about the law's age, but this isn't about how old the Hatch Act is. It's about how she abused her position to push a narrative, Karoline countered without missing a beat. Then show me where the statute says public figures can't speak boldly. If boldness is a crime, Washington should be empty by Friday. A murmur of laughter, quickly stifled, rippled through the gallery. Judge Mendez's brow furrowed, not in disapproval but in reconsideration. He turned toward Karoline, leaning forward slightly. You're saying the law as written doesn't apply to your actions? Karoline nodded. I'm saying it can't, not unless we rewrite it for the digital age. She paused. Otherwise we're punishing people not for breaking the law, but for operating outside its imagination. The line landed. The tension had reached its peak and the room knew something had shifted. The battle wasn't just between a prosecutor and a press secretary anymore. It was between two visions of the law, one stuck in the past, the other forcing its way into the future. Just when the courtroom thought the tension had peaked, Karoline Leavitt reached into her briefcase with unhurried precision and pulled out a thick tabbed binder, the kind of document that didn't just respond to accusations but detonated them. She held it up for the jury to see. "This," she said calmly, "is the proposed 2023 Ethics Committee draft for modernizing the Hatch Act." A hush fell over the room. Even Judge Mendez straightened in his seat. It's not some fringe memo or social media post. It's an internal government proposal acknowledging that the current Hatch Act is fundamentally outdated and suggesting urgent reforms for the digital age. She flipped to a highlighted section and read aloud, "No action taken via digital press platforms, including live-streamed briefings, shall constitute a violation unless expressly tied to electioneering or campaign activity." Her finger tapped the page for emphasis. "That's not from me, that's from your government. The very body that enforces this law is admitting that it's ill-embedded for the world I operate in." The jury leaned forward. Even the press gallery, which had been furiously typing, paused mid-keystroke. Lara Vincente, still standing near the prosecution table, stiffened. "That's a draft, not law," she said sharply. "It hasn't been passed." Karoline nodded. "Exactly. And yet I'm being prosecuted as if it has. They're picking and choosing what fits their narrative while ignoring what doesn't support their case." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, if Congress hasn't enacted these changes, how can I be punished for violating standards that even the Ethics Committee knows are obsolete?" Vincente pushed back, louder now. "Obsolete or not, the law as it exists is enforceable, and that statement, 'Canada is on its knees,' was designed to boost the image of a political leader. That is influence." But Karoline didn't blink. "Influence isn't a violation. Campaigning is. And again, I made that statement in February 2025 when there wasn't a single Trump rally scheduled or campaign material published. That's not an election year. That's a policy year." She paused and then delivered the uppercut. "And if I hadn't said anything at that briefing, I'd have been failing my job as press secretary. So let's be honest. Either way, they were coming for me. Either I speak and get sued for influence, or I stay silent and get sued for neglect. That's not law, that's entrapment." The judge exhaled slowly, flipping through the binder now handed to him by a clerk. He scanned the highlighted notes, his eyes narrowing. "This is real?" he muttered. Karoline answered without hesitation. "Filed with the Office of Government Ethics, March 2023, circulated internally, ignored publicly, because updates don't serve political narratives, but justice isn't about narratives. It's about logic." Across the aisle, Vincente's face had tightened. Her grip on her notes betrayed the panic behind her poised facade. Karoline stepped back from the podium, her voice low but firm. "The truth is, they don't want to admit the law hasn't kept up, because if they do, this whole case falls apart, and right now, that's exactly what it's doing." The courtroom sat in stunned silence. For the first time, Karoline hadn't just defended herself. She'd cornered the prosecution with their own rules, their own oversight, their own failure to evolve, and that binder, filled with dusty truth and inconvenient facts, had just delivered the punch they never saw coming. The courtroom, once a circus of snickers and camera clicks, now simmered in silence as Judge Raul Mendez sat motionless behind the bench. Karoline's binder of government documents spread open before him. His fingers traced the highlighted passages slowly, almost absently, while his mind raced. The prosecutor remained standing, her jaw tense, the once confident gleam in her eyes replaced by a dull sheen of unease. Karoline, by contrast, stood quietly at the defense table, arms relaxed, watching not with defiance but with composed expectancy. She knew the weight of what she had dropped into the courtroom. It wasn't just a binder, it was a bomb. And now Judge Mendez had to decide whether to defuse it or let it rewrite the rules. For the first time, he looked at her not as a political prop, not as a Gen Z firebrand, but as someone who had just made a constitutional scholar pause. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier sarcasm. "I'll admit, I came into this room today expecting spin, a show, maybe even an attempt to dodge the law." He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "But what I've seen is something different. You haven't just responded to the charges, you've exposed the structural cracks in how they were built." His eyes drifted to Lara Vincent, who looked as if she were trying to swallow air. The court cannot ignore that the Hatch Act, as written, makes no specific provision for modern platforms like live-streamed briefings or viral soundbites. Nor can it ignore that even the government itself has acknowledged this need for reform. Karoline remained still, allowing the judge's own reasoning to unfold. Mendez looked down once more at the Ethics Committee draft, then toward the audio recording the prosecution had submitted, an exhibit now tainted by timing and ambiguity. "And regarding the late evidence," he continued, voice firmer now, "it arrives too conveniently, without chain of custody verification. If it mattered that much, it should have been here from the start." A subtle shift rippled through the jury box. Eyes that had once been wary of Karoline now gleamed with a mixture of curiosity and respect. She hadn't just survived crossfire, she had made a battlefield feel like a classroom. Judge Mendez placed his glasses back on, exhaled deeply, and spoke the words that would ripple far beyond the courtroom. "I cannot in good conscience continue with a case that rests on outdated law, ambiguous evidence, and what appears to be a politically motivated prosecution. The court finds Miss Leavitt not liable, case dismissed." The gavel hit wood, sharp, final, but the sound for once didn't feel like an end. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter in how America would view power, speech, and the next generation's place in rewriting the rules. The doors of the Miami Federal Courthouse swung open, and the chaos waiting outside surged like a wave crashing against a dam. Reporters shouted Karoline Leavitt's name from every direction, shoving microphones forward, phones raised high, live streams blinking red. A handful of protesters chanted angrily while dozens of Gen Z supporters, many waving homemade signs that read, "Truth greater than legacy law," and "Karoline equals Constitution too," cheered as if welcoming a victorious quarterback after the Super Bowl. Karoline emerged calmly, flanked by her attorney Alan Rourke and two aides. She wore the same navy blazer, her expression cool but unmistakably resolved. Cameras flashed wildly as she paused just before the courthouse steps. A young reporter from a streaming news channel leaned forward, voice urgent. "Ms. Leavitt, what do you have to say to the prosecutor, to the country?" Karoline adjusted her blazer sleeve and replied without hesitation, her voice carrying over the crowd. "I think logic and the Constitution did their job today. The law isn't a weapon for revenge. It's a safeguard for everyone, even those the system wants to silence." Her words rippled instantly through the crowd. Chants of "Karoline! Karoline!" erupted from the corner where conservative students had gathered, several of them recording reaction videos in real time. Not far from them, a CNN correspondent whispered into a camera, "We've just witnessed one of the most dramatic legal reversals in recent memory." But Karoline wasn't done. Another reporter shouted, "Do you see this as a win for Trump?" She tilted her head slightly, a faint smile touching the edge of her lips. "It's a win for truth. And yes, for President Trump, who taught me something early on. Never apologize for telling it straight." The press pool buzzed again, voices rising, but Karoline had already begun walking down the courthouse steps. She didn't need to say more. The message was clear, and the internet was already catching fire. Within minutes, hashtags like "Karoline crushes it" and "Hatch Act reboot" were trending on X. Clips of her courtroom takedown, especially the line, "That's like enforcing traffic laws on someone flying a drone," spread like wildfire, stitched into TikToks and reaction threads by influencers and legal scholars alike. Supporters called her the Gen Z Iron Dome, while even some skeptics begrudgingly admitted she'd outlawyered the system with its own paperwork. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, the prosecutor quietly gathered her things, her once pristine case folder now splayed open and limp, and back in Washington, President Trump, watching from the West Wing, reportedly grinned and said, "That's my press secretary." But for Karoline Leavitt, this moment wasn't about applause, it was about precedent. She had just proved that youth, armed with facts and fearlessness, could not only survive the old guard, they could rewrite the script. And as she stepped into the waiting SUV, already dialing into a post-trial strategy call, she wasn't thinking about vindication. She was thinking about what came next. The next morning, the White House press room buzzed with an energy that hadn't been felt in months. Reporters whispered among themselves, cameras already rolling long before the briefing began. At exactly 9:00 IEM, the doors opened, and Karoline Leavitt stepped up to the podium like she never left. Same blazer, same composure. But now, something had shifted. She wasn't just the youngest press secretary in history, she was the woman who had just stood trial, dismantled a federal case, and walked out with the judge's respect and the nation's attention. As the press corps hushed, she scanned the room with cool confidence, then smiled faintly. "Let's get started," she said. The first question came instantly. A skeptical reporter from a legacy network leaned in, voice probing. "Ms. Leavitt, after everything that happened in court, do you think the Hatch Act needs to be rewritten?" Karoline didn't hesitate. "Laws are like tech," she said, her signature Gen Z smirk flashing just briefly. "If they don't update, they get hacked by reality. I'm not here to break the rules. I'm here to make sure they evolve with the time." Her response was clipped, clean, and already being transcribed into headlines. Another reporter followed up. "Are you worried about backlash?" Karoline raised an eyebrow. "I think we've all seen what happens when truth makes people uncomfortable. That's not backlash, that's proof it mattered." Behind her, the American flag swayed lightly in the filtered DC light. On social media, livestream comments exploded with hearts and fire emojis. Influencers posted side-by-sides of her courtroom closing with clips from this press conference, dubbing it Gen Z's return to the mic. Karoline didn't play to the hype. She answered a few more questions, handled a jab about decorum, then rapped with a line that would echo well beyond the press room. "We don't inherit freedom fully formed, we shape it, and we defend it, even when the rules weren't built for us." With that, she stepped down, leaving the podium behind, but her presence stamped into every camera lens. In a town built on legacy, she had become something harder to ignore, a future you couldn't unsee. The story of Karoline Leavitt's courtroom battle is more than a legal drama. It's a powerful lesson in how courage, clarity, and command of the truth can challenge even the most entrenched systems. At just 27, Karoline didn't crumble under political pressure or media mockery. Instead, she turned silence into strategy and used outdated laws as a stage to spotlight a bigger problem. When institutions fail to evolve, justice itself becomes distorted. Her unwavering belief in logic over theatrics proved that knowledge, not age, legacy, or title, is what earns respect in the courtroom and beyond. She reminded the nation that defending truth sometimes means standing alone, and that the law, like democracy, must adapt to the realities of its time. By refusing to be intimidated and instead confronting the law with its own words, Karoline didn't just win a case, she sparked a national conversation about fairness, free speech, and the need to modernize outdated rules. Her story is a call to action for a new generation. Know your rights, speak boldly, and never let the weight of old systems silence a voice built for the future. In the end, the real victory wasn't hers alone. It was for anyone who refuses to be boxed in by obsolete boundaries.